Gun violence has been escalating in America. The medical community calls it a public health issue, and it wants government-funded research to help search for a solution. But right now, federal law bans that. In fact, just before shots were fired in Southern California, researchers were calling for the law to be changed. Al Jazeera's Patricia Sabga reports.
Hours before the 355th mass shooting in the United States this year, a plea from doctors around the country for Congress to lift restrictions on federal funding for research into gun violence.
There are 89 people a day who are dying in this country from gun violence. We know that we can prevent this if we have the data to really take the measures that we need.
For nearly 2 decades, the NRA-backed Dickey Amendment has effectively blocked the Centers for Disease Control from researching the causes of gun violence, a constraint the NRA successfully lobbied Congress to extend to the National Institutes of Health in 2011.
The Dickey Amendment stipulates that federal money cannot be tapped for research that advocates or promotes gun control. But many medical professionals say researching the causes of gun violence is a legitimate use of public funds for what they consider a public health crisis.
Last month, House Democrats took the same tact, arguing the U.S. spends $240 million a year on traffic safety research, $223 million on food safety, and $331 million on tobacco effects, but almost nothing on firearms that kill 33,000 Americans annually.
This is common sense that we would put money into researching the different ways that we can prevent gun violence while still maintaining the Second Amendment. They are not in conflict at all.
And while many gun rights advocates see the public health argument as a fig leaf for gun control, former GOP Representative Jay Dickey of Arkansas called for the amendment that bears his name to be repealed, arguing that research on gun violence could have continued without infringing on the rights of gun owners. Patricia Sabga, Al Jazeera.
There are stark differences in gun laws across the country. Some are strict, others are quite lenient. Here's a look at how some of those states compare. In California, where the San Bernardino attack happened this week, the gun laws are strict. All firearm sales must go through a licensed dealer, and the state constitution does not guarantee a right to bear arms. Compare that to Utah, just 2 states away, and the laws loosen up quite a bit. The minimum age to own a firearm is 18. A permit is not required to purchase a handgun, rifle, or shotgun. Owning a machine gun is allowed. On to the East Coast in New Jersey, a permit is required to possess any handgun, including antique guns. Back out west in Arizona, where owning a gun is easier. Owners with a permit can carry their gun openly or concealed, and no hands-on firearm training is required. Cross the Pacific to Hawaii, and once again, it gets more difficult. Permits mandatory. Background checks and a 14-day waiting period are required. And finally, back to the East Coast for what is perhaps one of the most lenient states for gun ownership, Vermont, where the legal age to purchase a handgun is just 16 years old. And in case you were wondering, no, that does not require a parent's permission. Robin Thomas is the executive director at the Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence. She is in San Francisco this evening. Robin, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So, Robin, California, as we mentioned, has the strictest gun laws in the country. Among many guidelines, gun owners must pass a universal background check to own a gun and take and pass a written safety test. Some studies even suggest that stricter gun laws lead to a reduction in gun violence. Is it shocking to you that this happened in your state?
It's shocking when it happens anywhere, and it's a devastating tragedy in a state like California, where legislators and the people here have been taking every possible step to reduce gun violence and to have an impact on this problem. You know, notwithstanding the horrific events of last week, California has one of the lowest gun death rates in the entire country. And I attribute that to both the really intelligent legislation that's been passed here, as well as very comprehensive community programming to address this problem. It's very difficult to find ways to stop every shooting and tragedy, but we have seen a tremendous reduction in gun death and gun violence in California in the last 20 years.
So there's California, and then there are states like Louisiana and Mississippi and Arizona where gun laws are the weakest. For example, in Mississippi, there's no limit on the amount of firearms that a person can buy at any given time. A gun owner doesn't have to be licensed, and they don't have to register their firearms. Can you explain why gun laws are so lax in these states?
Well, in the U.S., we have our very, very limited federal laws, which really only apply to a few specific instances, background checks, if you buy your gun from a licensed dealer, not from a private seller. And that's it. That's the only law we have at the federal level. The gun manufacturers are even immune from Consumer Protection Act and get the best immunity from liability of any industry anywhere in the country. And then you have state laws. So each state, depending on the politics of that state, the makeup of the legislature and the governor's office, can pass whatever laws are appropriate for that state. And unfortunately, when it comes to gun control laws or gun regulation on any level, in states where you have this as a wedge political issue, really nothing gets done. Arizona was brought up before. Arizona has probably the weakest gun laws in the country. There is no background check required on private gun sales. You can carry, as you mentioned, loaded firearms, either openly or concealed, with no background check, no permit, no regulation whatsoever. And it's just astounding to me that we aren't doing more about this. Law-abiding gun owners, NRA members and gun owners in America, and certainly Americans in general, overwhelmingly support common sense, intelligent gun laws like background checks and basic restrictions which help keep our communities safer. And yet our legislators and elected officials have utterly failed to do anything to protect our communities and implement those reforms.
Yeah, and we've been hearing a lot of both sides from this debate over this past week. Your organization ranks gun laws state by state every year. What do you think contributed to tougher gun laws in states like California and New Jersey?
Well, California has been leading the way for the last 2 decades in passing the cutting-edge reforms that we see on the books now. It was really right after the tragedy at Sandy Hook Elementary School in 2013 that the legislation really started to pick up in other states. So states like New York, New Jersey, Colorado, Maryland, Delaware, Massachusetts. There's been a wave of states that have passed new, really comprehensive and important legislation since that tragedy. And many of those laws have been based upon the types of regulations that we see here in California. So I think what we saw was California really leading that edge. And then when the political opportunity shifted a little bit in that time after the shooting at Newtown, a whole set of states, Connecticut, of course, leading the way as well, passed new laws to try and take a step forward. And it's been really quite a sea change. There's been 117 laws passed since the shooting at Sandy Hook. And even in the last couple of years, we've seen almost 20 states pass laws strengthening domestic violence prohibitions. Now 18 states require a background check of some type on all gun sales in the state. So you really have seen a huge amount of leaps forward at the state level that you don't hear about that often.
And my last question for you is, for the first time in nearly 100 years, the New York Times today published an editorial on its front page that piece puts federal lawmakers' feet to the fire on the issue of gun control. Do you think that this latest mass shooting will lead to any action on the federal level?
I really hope it does. It is hard to have optimism about what goes on in Washington, D.C. sometimes, particularly on this issue, but I think the American people are getting really fed up with these tragedies, the fact that it continues, and not once after any of these tragedies, not after Virginia Tech, not after what happened at Newtown, not after Roseburg, Oregon, or even this week, do they do anything. And I think the American people are getting really tired of seeing the federal legislators not step up and represent their interests. If 92% of the American people support background checks, we have to ask ourselves who our federal legislators are representing if they're not representing 92% of the American people. It's tragic, and this is not going to stop until action is taken. I really hope this is the time that some progress forward is made.
All right. Thank you so much, Robin, for your input on the issue of gun control here in the United States. Thanks again.
I'm the leading state sponsor of terrorism